Hello. To be or not to be, that is the question. I want to talk today about what I think is the most fundamental, as well as probably the most interesting, as well as also perhaps the scariest, most horrifying question in philosophy, and that is the question, the difference between life denial and life affirmation. Now, I'm going to say outright from the get-go that I am an avid life affirmer. 100% I'm a life affirmer. I can't see myself, I can't really see myself being anything else. I could see myself turning into a life denier with certain experiences, with enough certain experiences, but then again, I could also see myself overcoming those and still continuing to be a life affirmer. I think I definitely lean more in that direction. So I don't see my mind really being changed on this, but I still want to talk about the discussion, because I think it's what's interesting. I didn't really know life denial existed until about October of this year. Until I made my first antinatalism video, I didn't realize what life denial really was. I mean, I knew that obviously there's people who were suicidal and people who didn't want to live and stuff like that, but I didn't realize what the extent to which it existed. I didn't really think it existed at an impersonal level as avidly as it does exist, you know, as I found out. And I kind of want to comment on this because it's very perplexing. And I think part of me still wants to say that life denial is still sort of very life-affirming, somewhere deep underneath all of it. But that's a discussion that would need to be had. I think it's fascinating. You know, it's the most dangerous discussion because you're gambling with almost everything. You know, I think every other question out there, every other moral question, every other debate, all of it boils down to what the answer to this question is. If you're a life affirmer, that decides the answer to every other ethical question that ever exists. It automatically decides all the answers because all the answers are going to be inherited from this guiding principle. You cannot accept any answer that is not life-affirming, which means you must pick the answer that is the most life-affirming. And this applies in things like politics, science, art, all of it. You know, something is good art if it helps us be life-affirming as a society. Something's good science if it helps us survive. Something is good, you know, etc. Everything follows from it. So if you're debating it, you're kind of gambling with everything. You stand to lose basically everything, every single thing that you believe and do. Every single thing that I believe and do right now in the present is inherited from this ultimate idea, this guiding principle of life affirmation. So if I have the argument and I lose, then I lose everything. It's literally a matter of life or death, philosophically speaking. What? It's almost as close as a matter of life or death as it gets. I want to understand life denial because I really, you know, I don't understand, like I didn't really understand why it exists in the way that it does. I've heard a lot of arguments for it, but the arguments don't prove, I don't see how the conclusion follows from the arguments. See, I can understand life denial, you know, if that was just the assumption. Like if the assumption to if the answer to the question was assumed, you know, not to be is the answer and that's it, well then I wouldn't ask any other questions. I mean, that would be kind of weird and it would be kind of arbitrary and it wouldn't really make any sense. But if that's taken as an axiom, well then everything else is understood. But if it's not taken as an axiom, because I think from life deniers, to them it's more of a conclusion from other things that are more foundational. And that's the part that I think is weird. Because if there's anything that's more foundational than life denial itself, then that thing that's more foundational must be life-affirming. Because life must have been present for whatever the other foundational thing is to be for you to be aware of it. You must be alive, which means you must be life-affirming in that sense. And then it becomes a really weird kind of belief. It's like you must be affirming life in order to be able to deny life. You know, there's this author called Zapfe who talked about how life is just absurd. The reality of our experience is so absurd, and so we should just deny the will to live. And, the problem there is that you can't use the absurdity to conclude anything. That absurdity, you can't use the absurdity to conclude anything like that. And if you do use the absurdity to conclude something you think is correct, that means the fact that you came to realize what the absurdity was in the first place was correct, which means you can't be against the thing that led you to realize it in the first place. And Zopfe talks about how he has these interesting metaphors about how intelligent design, evolution made a mistake when we developed these big brains, because with these big brains we could understand how absurd life is and everything like that. And it's like, well, then that's not a mistake, then, is it? If you could understand something and that life is absurd and it leads to a conclusion, and this is all correct reasoning, and this is something that happened via evolution, then evolution didn't make a mistake, then it made the correct choice, right? Furthermore, it's also a problem because if you're saying that everything's absurd, you can't draw any conclusion from that, because the conclusion is just as absurd as the absurdity of life itself. Deciding not to live is as absurd as deciding to live. So there's no preference of one over the other. There's clear and obvious ways, I think, in which the whole thing sort of collapses. But I want to understand why the life denier is so attracted to the idea. Because to me, I can only, what they say, but I kind of like, again, what they say is very alien to me. It's very kind of just like, I can't relate to it easily. I could relate to the idea that, like, I'm in pain, I don't want to live, but that's not really the same thing. I'm in pain, I don't want to live. They're taking it a step further. First of all, they're not committing suicide. They're continuing to live to try and encourage this idea. Like, what's driving that? It doesn't follow from the assumptions. At least it doesn't seem to follow from what they state. So that's why it's interesting, and I kind of want to know how it all works. I have my own theories, of course, as to the difference between life affirmation and life denial, but those are all just theories. I don't know exactly, I don't know exactly what the truth of it all is. And I think that's sort of a mistake, because like most people probably don't think of this question at all. To them, the difference between life affirmation and life denial, they're almost obviously just going to be life affirming. And life denial in this sense is just going to sound stupid, and they're going to be like, well, that's just dumb. And it's just thoughtless, dismissal of the idea. And, and they'll say, well, the life deniers are just idiots, or they're just, depressed people. And, they're not stupid. They're definitely not stupid people. Ever since Molyneux, I've also been of the idea that, stupid people, calling someone stupid doesn't really explain anything. You could take the smartest person on earth and change around their sensibilities and their experiences, and they'll fall on any part of the spectrum for anything. So this has nothing to do with stupidity. There are intelligent, life-denying people. One could even argue that, as a group, they're intelligent, because a person who's not intelligent but is suicidal might just commit suicide. To them, it's sort of more. It's more erotaic. There's like a virtue behind it, and that's the part that's interesting, because like I just can't relate to that concept, and I want to understand how they make that connection. Because in my mind, all the things that we value, truth and virtue and all these things, they're all interconnected, but they're also all connected to the idea of life affirmation. Life denial seems like this lonely point out here in the distance to which nothing is directly connected. But with these people, it's like the other way around. To them, life affirmation is the thing that's disconnected. Life denial is the thing that's interconnected with everything. So, it's kind of, it's just bizarre. How do you think like that? How does somebody believe that? It's just so strange. It's so strange where that could, so I'd love nothing more than to like talk to a a life denier and really understand and like pick their brain and be able to try and arrive at what they think, why they think this, because everything I've heard, at least through comments and conversation, just hasn't added up. It hasn't been enough. I haven't been enough to see their side. My theory, I'm going to talk about my theory about what's behind life denial. I think what's behind life denial is, well, I mean, partially it's a desire to escape from suffering. That's certainly present. That's certainly a thing that's there. But I feel like I don't see how you can justify that to the extent that they do, where it just applies non-transiently, non-proximately. It applies to everything. That everyone needs to escape suffering, even when everyone needs to escape suffering, even if they don't want to. And some say this ties in closely with antinatalism, and first I want to explain a bit, because and antinatalists will say that they're not life deniers. They might say that you can continue living, that's fine, you just can't have kids. Their whole thing is like having kids is bad. But I think that and they have this whole thing where they like react negatively to people who think it's okay to have children and bring them into the world and so on and so forth. But they think that that's somehow incredibly unfair. It's like you're incurring your beliefs upon other people. But I want to point out how neither side is being more unfair than the other side in this case, because from their perspective, because what the antinatalists are denying the life affirmers is they're denying life affirmation. If a life affirmer, okay, think about it like this. What is the difference between a life-affirming person and a life-denying people if both of them lived for the same amount? Let's say that I'm a life affirmer and there's a life denier, and he doesn't want to kill himself, but he's a life denier, and he lives for 60 years old and I live till I'm 60, and we both die and we both can't prevent this, and neither of us are trying to prevent our deaths at 60. What's the difference between us? Well, the difference is what makes me a life affirmer and this other person a life denier. The difference is how we apply this to other people. The difference is how we apply this standard to things beyond ourselves. And I think the whole point of the idea of life affirmation is that it is inherently, by definition, a belief system about something that goes far beyond yourself. It wouldn't be life affirmation if it's just a choice you're making for yourself. If it's a choice you're making for people in general, then it becomes true life affirmation. Because if I'm a life affirmer, I don't just care about whatever it is that I do in my life. I'm not minded by what I get to do now. I do what I get to do now based on what I hope happens later on, based on what I hope happens when I'm not around. It's like self-sacrifice, sacrificing yourself so that somebody else could live. I might be a life affirmer, but I could see circumstances which I would, at a drop of a hat, sacrifice my own life, for the life of some other people, or for a cause or something like that. That kind of behavior exists. So, that is it's this whole idea of believing in values that go beyond your own experience. And the life deniers believe in this as well, because they are also advocating for a standard that goes far beyond our existence, because they're advocating for life denial, which by definition goes beyond our existence. They're saying that the ultimate end is when there's no life, which is, no one's around to benefit from that, but that's still good. That's, that by definition also goes beyond the boundaries of our experience. So the point is, this is what makes sort of, life affirmation and life denial the ultimate question, is that, if I'm a life affirmer, every single person that's a life denier is a loss for me. My goal of life affirmation is diminished by every other person out there that is not a life affirmer like myself. Every single other one, makes things harder for me. For example, obvious way in which this is true, I mean, if I'm the only life affirmer on Earth, my ability to keep things alive and everybody else is a life denier, and everybody else commits suicide or whatever, my ability to get the things that I want is now diminished because everybody else is gone. And it's not just about me being able to get the things that I want, it's about me being able to keep alive things that I think go beyond myself. Things like, you know, my genetic line, my memes, culture, art, knowledge of the universe, civilization. These are all things that, you could argue that they're not living beings, but from the perspective of life affirmation, what counts as alive and what doesn't is sort of, that's a separate sort of issue. From the perspective of life affirmation, one could have the goal to keep all of these things alive, quote unquote, biomes alive, ecosystems alive, Gaia alive as a whole. Any kind of holistic minded person could say that systems, should be kept alive and kept working the way that they do, because that has some sort of value. And you're denying that if you're a life denier. So, or even if you're not a life denier, but you're an antinatalist, you're denying that. You're denying the ability to keep systems alive. You're not for diminishing the lives of individuals, but you are for diminishing the lives of systems. And the problem with that is that, by definition, a life affirmer does things in their own life because of their desire to keep certain systems alive. So that's why I'm saying, if you're a life affirmer, anyone who's a life denier is philosophically is already your enemy in a sense, because they can't, your goals, they are a detriment to you. Their ability to be anti-life is a loss for the life affirmer, and vice versa. If you're a life denier, the life affirmer is a loss for your goal, because if they're a life affirmer, they're going to keep trying to create life. So this is why I think, antinatalists, who think that a person, you can be a life affirmer, but you can't be a life creator. I don't think it works like that. I think if you're a life affirmer, you are necessarily going to be pro-life creation. If not, then you're not really a life affirmer. Deep down, you're something else. It's not going to work in the sense that, like, oh, I'm a life affirmer, but I can't have that because, the antinatalists have prescribed antinatalism, and I'm going to obey that. See, no, that only works if what you're trying to conserve by, prescribing the prescriptions of antinatalists and stuff is if that stuff is somehow more important than the life-affirming ultimate goal itself. And it's not more important by definition. If you're a life affirmer, this is the thing that is behind your every decision. So I suppose there might be a difference between, antinatalists and, at least there might be a difference between me and a lot of people. And this really isn't exclusive to antinatalists, but they see, people's goals as personal goals, and they see people's goals as separate. And what I'm saying is that individual goals are non-separable non-transiently. People's personal goals are really, like, an individual's personal goals are really everybody's goals. Really, they're entangled with everybody's goals, ultimately. Not approximately, but ultimately. The difference being, in the present, in the short term, I can do something that doesn't affect you, and that's totally fair, whatever. But in the long term, everything I do does affect you, which means in the long term, my ultimate goal is also your ultimate goal. And if my ultimate goal conflicts with your ultimate goal, well, then one of our ultimate goals has to go. One of our ultimate goals has to become the other person's ultimate goal, otherwise they're going to forever clash. Which is why this is what I talk about all the time when I say, the entanglement of value and the entanglement of preferences. Everyone's ultimate goals, every single human being's ultimate goals are entangled in this way and related. A person can't pursue their own personal goal without and subscribe to, like, certain prescriptions from life deniers, but still be free to pursue their ultimate goals. No, they have to throw away certain ultimate goals as well, in order to be able to pursue those prescriptions. Because the reason why is because the prescriptions are the thing that determine what the ultimate goal gets to be. They determine what the access to the ultimate goal is, which means that if your ultimate goal is life. So, even if your ultimate goal isn't life denial, that's just a consequence of the prescription that you're, putting forward. It doesn't matter because it is effectively still your ultimate goal. It's the ultimate end that you're driving at. And vice versa. If your ultimate goal is life affirmation, well, then you're going to prescribe things in the present, in the proximate term, that adhere to that ultimate goal. So it is entirely about ultimate goals. It's a difference between, life or death. That's what it's the difference of. It's not the difference between birth and non-birth. It's the difference between life or death. It's the difference between life affirmation and non-life affirmation. And that's why I don't think any person who's truly life affirming could be an antinatalist. I just don't see how it's just not going to work. That's why antinatalists always augment it with, oh yeah, also you should be a life denier. So, unless you want to talk about antinatalism in like a provisional sense, if you want to say that, no, it's not ultimately true, it's just, a priority thing, it's provisionally true. But if it's provisionally true, then that means it's not always true, so you have to, explain where it applies and where it doesn't apply. And hell, I could be a provisional antinatalist. Hell, I think I am a provisional antinatalist. I think there's obvious, I could easily think of a circumstance where I don't think a person should have kids, but I'm not any kind of ultimate antinatalist. I think the problem is, people aren't, I'm a very sort of I'm very long-term thinking kind of person, maybe sort of a far-sighted person. So, when someone comes in, and a lot of people talk about what's right and rights and this and that, and it's always just like, it's always like, they perceive what's right and wrong today, in the present, and they take that as the foundation, and then come what may after that, the consequence shall be whatever. But what I'm saying is that that's not the rational thing. The rational thing is, the present is not the foundation. The priority, the highest priority action in the present is not the foundation of morality. The morality is in the future. The morality is in the consequences. It's in the guiding principles. That's where the foundation is. It's in the guiding principles, which means it's in the far side, in the future. The present is inherited from that. The present, what we do in the present is inherited, from the guiding principle that tells us what we want for the future. And my proof of this would simply be the fact that take any human being on Earth, any person, and even if this is the most avid, staunch advocate of some sort of deontological, ethical idea, and they're saying, no, don't kill, don't do this, don't do that, with enough information, you could convince them to change their mind. You could convince them that, whatever thing they're prescribing for the present doesn't actually apply, given what's going to happen after that. And what that means is that the real sort of truth isn't located in the present. It's not located in the priorities. It's located somewhere else, somewhere somewhere greater than that. It's more, the foundation is located outside of any decision we make. The decisions we make are inherited by the foundation, which tells us about the future. So that's sort of how I perceive it, and that's why I think antinatalism especially is like the quintessential example of taking the short-term priority and treating it as the long-term goal. It's taking the short-term priority action and treating it as the long-term goal. And this is my attitude, has been towards all actions, whether it's death, murder or theft or anything, any individual action you name, all of them are only provisionally wrong. They're only ever provisionally bad. There are cases where each of those things makes sense to do. And what that means is that's the ultimate goal that decides. But so then this is like the perspective, and this is why I don't think you could possibly say that life affirmers are only being unfair insofar as they are life affirmers. It's not really a question between natalism and antinatalism. It's a question between life affirmation and life denial. Life affirmers, insofar as they're life affirmers, are going to be open to the idea of creating life. There's just no way around that. There's nothing to convince them that they shouldn't do that. There's nothing, because it's their fundamental belief in life affirmation that tells them that it's okay to do that, you know? So you need to break that. You can't detach life affirmation from, you know, the question of should you create life or not. Just like you can't, you know, they're all attached. Like I said, it's all interconnected from the beginning. You know, these things are all interconnected, so you can't detach the ideas. You have to break the central idea, which is that life affirmation is wrong. That's why, you know, antinatalism is really, it's the short-term prescription, but the ultimate goal is life denial. Of course, you know, you can't be, if you come in and say, I'm a life denier, that's going to turn off more people than not. Antinatalism sounds more palatable when you talk about it, and maybe this is an attempt at trying to make themselves seem more palatable, but I mean, this is the way it works, you know. So I think, you know, any antinatalist that is not a provisional antinatalist, so an antinatalist that is sort of an absolute antinatalist, is really a life denier, and that's the thing that's behind their decision. It's not, antinatalism does not lead to the conclusion of life denial. Life denial is, you know, antinatalism, the prescription of antinatalism is inherited from the goal of life denial. So it's the other way around. But more so, let me just talk just more about the idea of life denial itself, because that is the thing that's like very still weird to me, because life denial seems to me like a very, it's something that only the life, you know, living people can do. You know, you can't, a non-living person can't be a life denier. And I think that in this kind of weird way, this is why I mentioned earlier, I don't see the logic of it. I think life affirmation, I see it sort of in the same category as like nihilism. You know, a person says there's no value, but then they act as if there is value. You know, they act assuming that there's, you know, they have an idea of value in their minds. But then, and then I say, well then, you know, but and the nihilist insists, well, no, value doesn't exist, but I think that there is value. But then I see you saying that value doesn't exist means nothing at that point. And it's the same kind of thing here. You know, you're a life denier, but you're not, you are for life coming to the conclusion that life denial is the way, which means you must be life affirming in some sense. And that makes everything very strange, because then it makes the whole ideology, because, you know, take it to its non-transient, to its most non-transient level, it makes it look like you're for life existing so that life could realize that life is bad, so to be life denial. And that just seems weird. That seems arbitrary and nonsensical, right? And that's because it's because of that whole thing, where I think like life denying, what it does is it takes the proximate, it takes the transient desire of escaping suffering and such, and applies that to everything, applies that to the whole. And what I'm saying is you can't apply that to the whole. You can't apply that to the whole because you have to be life-affirming in the whole, because you have to be for all of the things that led you to get to your conclusion, which means you have to be life-affirming in some sense. So, you know, it's a weird kind of argument, and this is why I'm saying I really want to have a discussion with a life denier, because I just want to see how it all works together. If I'm correct in that it's all just a drive to escape, and that's really all it is, well then the mistake, then the thing with life denial is that life denial is as simple as somebody, you know, taking this drive to this horror, you know, horror at life, this drive to escape, taking it way too far. It's not really life denial in an objective sense. The other problem with life denial, and this is clear, is that it is another sort of quintessential example of people trying to take a God's eye view on life as a whole and be like, life is like this, not like this, and therefore we can conclude that. But as I've argued many times, God's eye views are not really God's eye views. You know, any kind of impersonal value judgment is just an extension of a personal value judgment. You know, the third person God's eye view is just the extension of a first person God's eye view. You know, we just define it to be the first person God's eye views. There really isn't such a thing as a third person God's eye view. Because if there was, you know, if you are someone who claims to have a third-person God's eye view, then you must have made assumptions, and those are assumptions that you've made from your first-person, subjective view. And if it comes, which means it ultimately still comes back to your first-person subjective view. You can't escape the first-person view. And the life denial does kind of try and get at that. It tries to take this third-person view of like life and death, and take on like to analyze the difference between them. But that's also a thing, is like we don't even really understand what death is. I mean, death is just like, when we describe death, we use some sort of argument by analogy. We say, okay, it's like sleeping, or it's like sleeping without dreaming. It's like all these things. But these analogies, what we're really doing is we're just describing it as like an imaginary state that we're more familiar with. And you talk about it like sleeping because given that your closest analogy is sleeping, that makes death and unlife, rather, non-life, very much like, it makes it much more relatable. But and you associate it with things like safety and warmth, perhaps, and whatever, being escaping from whatever present shit is afflicting you in life, which is what sleeping sort of does. So given that that's the closest analogy, that analogy is like that dominates our perception of it. So what we're really doing when we compare in any comparative value way between like life and death is you're comparing the value of life and living like this to the value of, well, sleeping, or to the value of some kind of imaginary state that is the closest possible thing to death that we can imagine. But the point is that it's still something we imagine. It's still the whole perception of the relative value comes from the first person perspective and the first person ability to compare values, which means it's still life affirming in that sense. Whenever anyone that's life denial is really just affirming a different kind of state of being, a state of being that's different from living as it normally is. But the thing is, we can't truly understand what it's like to be in that state. Nobody really knows what it's like to be in a non-existent, death state. That doesn't exist. The most that we know is how similar that is to a state that we do occupy when we're alive, and we just say that it's exactly like that. So it's the whole thing I said earlier about extension. We take something familiar and we extend it to something that seems unfamiliar. And this is the only thing that we can do as humans. And so what that means is that's what we're always doing, and so it's not really a third person view of life or death. It's really just, it's really still life affirmation. It's really still life affirmation, but with extreme preference on this one particular kind of state that is most similar to sleeping without dreaming, or existing without memory, or whatever the fuck, the closest the closest metaphor you can come up with. And so that's still life affirming. And the question then is the question then stops being about, is it ultimately, to be or not to be? Is it ultimately life or death? But it's ultimately a question of, well, this imaginary state of lifelessness, being not alive, which is the most similar to sleeping without the dreaming, that state is supposed to be more preferable than anything else. And then it becomes a comparative value question. It's like, well, why is that state so much better? Couldn't you, what would have to happen if you're a life denier? What would you have to go through to perhaps think and believe that there was a better state than that? Why do you prefer that state to the other state is the question. So it always comes back to like, why is this state, preferable? And I think that the reason the state is preferable is itself sort of self deep down a life affirming reason. But the agent, the individual, doesn't realize that, they're not aware that basically they're making a value judgment for themselves based on two states: the state they're in and the state that they think is better, which is the safety of the lifelessness state, this imaginary state of non-existence. And they're taking that a step further and implying it to everyone. And the only reason they're taking it a step further is because they are taking the impersonal approach and doing the value extension thing that I said, and taking a God's eye view. Only it's not the correct God's eye view. Sorry, it's not that it's not the correct God's eye view, but the problem is because they themselves perhaps can't see that that there are better states than the imaginary lifelessness state, then because in their mind the lifelessness state is the best state, and this is also connected with their perception of it as like the objectively, third person God's eye view as the best state, and they can't see a better state because for whatever reason, they can't imagine a better state. So then they simply say, well, then this is just the best state, and you can't. It's immoral to try and be a life affirmer when there are no better states, or it's immoral to try and be a life affirmer and force other people into it when there are no better states objectively out there. So I think it's a problem. So this is my theory, again, with life denial. How I would explain it is that it's two things. It's number one is it's taking the God's eye view and, it's extending, it's taking the God's eye view and extending one's own perception of what the comparative values of different states are whilst being blind to the true values of certain states that are out there. And at the same time, it's the God's eye view. And the second thing is that it's the transient view. It's taking the short term and applying it to everything. And it's taking the this view that like life is bad and everything, and it's true some sort of metaphysical horror and metaphysical like anguish and acting as if that can't ever be overcome. Because ultimately it can perhaps be overcome. But it's two things. It's believing that the metaphysical, the metaphysical horror can't be overcome. Number one, Zapfe's horror can't be overcome. And number two, the idea that it can't be overcome is a third-person God's eye view, which means it's impersonally true, which means it's true all the time, etc. That's my theory. But again, I'd have to talk to a life denier. I really don't know. I was wrong before. So. I was wrong before when I approached the subject. So, I think I would really want to talk about it. I want to have some sort of discussion and really try and get to the bottom of these ideas. I think there's something very interesting there. I want to try and understand where the connections are being made. Because like I said before, I think life affirmation is sort of present in everything. Even in this kind of judgment, it's still life affirmation. Because remember, you're not comparing life to non-life. What you're comparing is sleeping to not sleep, to being awake and experiencing horror. It's like the difference between, well, we're going to torture you. You could be awake for this, or you could not be awake. You could be unconscious. It's like the difference there. So you're not really comparing life to lifelessness, which means it's still life affirming. Which means the question has nothing to do with the connection between life denial. It's got nothing to do with true life denial. It's got to do with the difference between these two states, and if there are other states that are out there, and if this connection is impersonally true. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. I'm just trying to sort of say it's kind of a bit of a gloomy subject for the holidays. I'm gonna say, but yeah, I don't see life denial as I think I don't see it as a viable option for myself. I don't see myself becoming something like this. It would be very interesting to try and have the discussion, but something tells me I think I'm sort of leaning in the right direction. But the thing is, if I'm not, if it's just then at worst, then the question is just arbitrary. And then the answer is arbitrary. And that's actually even scarier, because that means there's no way around the question. Everything you do as a life affirmer assumes every single action you make is inherited from the idea of life affirmation itself. That is the ultimate guiding principle. And you have no reason of knowing why that's the ultimate guiding principle. What if that's not the ultimate guiding principle? What if something else is an ultimate guiding principle? And you have no answer to the question. And there's nothing that predicates the question either. There's nothing that precedes the question of life or death. It's the ultimate thing. So, and you also can't escape it either. You can't, even if you assume an answer, it's like, you could argue it's like, well, the only reason you're a life affirmer is because you don't have enough information. Once I give you enough information, you'll stop being a life affirmer. Yeah, but I could argue once I give a life denier enough information, the same thing's going to happen. And I could argue that that just means information itself is somehow inherently valuable. But if information is inherently valuable, that probably assumes that life affirmation as well. So no matter what you do, you can't escape the question. And no matter which way you go and probe, you always come back to the question. There's no escaping it. There's no answering it. It's just it's like a paradox, I guess, in that way. But that's if I'm wrong. I think life denial could, in theory, be explained as sort of, it's sort of a wishful thinking kind of life affirmation. It's still life affirmation. It's just a very specific kind of wishful thinking. That's how I could explain it. It's similar to nihilism. Similar to nihilism, it's wishful thinking and taking a third-person God's eye view without realizing it. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I really want to know people's opinions, and if you're a life denier, by all means, I want to know what you think, because I think it's very weird. You weird me out, but I want to know where you make the connections. I know that it comes down to suffering at some point, but I need more than that to try and understand it. Anyway, that's about it. Oh yeah, and Happy New Year, folks, and by all means, if you want some life-affirming fucking quote at the end, sure, I'll give you one. Merry fucking Happy New Year, and be happy and affirm life, assholes. Cheers.